When is a fortress truly impregnable? That was the question on every noble's lips in the year 1204. Standing proudly on a limestone cliff above the river Seine, Château Gaillard was thought to be one of the most formidable castles in all of Europe. Commissioned by Richard the Lionheart himself, it was a bold symbol of defiance, an English stronghold planted firmly in French territory. Thick walls, steep cliffs, innovative design, Gaillard was built to last, but within just 7 years of its completion, it fell. Not to brute force, not to overwhelming numbers, but to something far more medieval: cunning, starvation, and human desperation. Today, we'll dive deep into the siege of Château Gaillard, the myths that surround it, the lives within its walls, and the forgotten economic and social stakes behind its rise and fall. Because to understand this castle is to understand the very world of medieval power, and how quickly that world could crumble. Let's rewind to the year 1196. Richard of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart, was locked in a cold war with King Philip II of France. Tensions ran high. Normandy, then under English control, was a prized and vulnerable possession. So Richard did what kings of his age often did to flex power and assert dominance. He built a castle. Not just any castle, a revolutionary fortress perched over the Seine. Château Gaillard was his passion project. Constructed in record time, just 2 years, it cost an astronomical £45,000. That's over a quarter of England's annual revenue at the time. Richard himself said of it, "Behold, how fair is this daughter of 1 year." The castle had multiple layers of defense: an outer bailey to protect supply and support buildings, a middle wall of reinforced towers, and an inner keep with complex curtain walls shaped in angles and curves, a groundbreaking innovation to deflect siege engines. It was a military marvel. But it was more than that. Château Gaillard controlled trade and river traffic, funneling tolls and taxes straight into Norman coffers. It also choked off access to the Seine Valley for Philip's expanding kingdom. It wasn't just a fortress, it was an economic chokehold. Fast forward to 1203, Richard was dead. His brother, King John, now ruled England, but lacked his siblings' political acumen and military flair. Normandy was slipping through his fingers, and Philip II of France saw his chance. With methodical precision, Philip began isolating Gaillard Dot. He cut off supply lines, captured nearby outposts, and slowly surrounded the castle. By the time the full siege began in December 1203, winter was closing in. Inside the walls were around 150 knights and soldiers, along with scores of civilians, women, children, and the elderly, who had fled from the surrounding countryside. Food dwindled fast. In one of the siege's darkest chapters, the commander inside the castle made a grim choice. In order to conserve food, he expelled over 400 non-combatants. Philip refused to let them pass. Trapped between two armies with no shelter and freezing temperatures, many died of cold and starvation in the no-man's land between walls. This was not a battle of swords, it was a battle of time, morale, and sheer will. Hollywood would have you believe that medieval sieges were all boiling oil and flaming arrows, but that's more myth than truth. Boiling oil? Unlikely. It was far too expensive and precious. Defenders might have used heated sand, water, or quicklime instead, more effective and less costly. Flaming arrows? They were used, but rarely. Most castle walls were made of stone, and fire wasn't a reliable weapon against them. Siege warfare was more about pressure and attrition. Philip's forces used several tried and tested methods: undermining, digging tunnels under walls and setting fires to collapse them, siege towers, rolling wooden towers that allowed troops to scale the walls, perriers and trebuchets, catapults to break down fortifications or bombard the keep, but ultimately the French didn't break the walls with brute force. They found a weak point, a forgotten latrine chute leading into the chapel. It was a narrow passage, hidden, but just large enough for a man to crawl through. And so, on March 6, 1204, a small French team entered the castle through the toilet shaft and opened the gates from within. A chronicler later wrote, "It was not by force that we entered, but through cunning and perseverance." Roger of Wendover. Château Gaillard, the unbreakable daughter of 1 year, had fallen. It's easy to picture knights and lords standing proud on the battlements. But what about the people who kept Gaillard running? Within the walls lived cooks working in smoky kitchens, trying to stretch food that was nearly gone, servants hauling water from frozen wells. Gong farmers, yes, the men who cleaned out the guardrobes, latrines, to keep disease at bay. Scribes and stewards maintaining records of dwindling supplies. Every person, high or low, had a role, and during the siege, they all shared one fate. This is one reason castles like Gaillard weren't just military hubs. They were self-contained ecosystems. Economically, they controlled the land around them, dictating taxation, local justice, agricultural production, trade regulation. For peasants in nearby villages, the castle meant protection, but also strict oversight and heavy dues. Lords often redirected trade routes and imposed market rules to benefit their own households. In fact, some towns actively resisted castle construction, fearing loss of autonomy. So while castles offered security, they also concentrated power in ways that could strangle local growth. The fall of Château Gaillard was not just a military loss. It was a turning point in European geopolitics. With Gaillard taken, Philip II seized all of Normandy. The English crown lost a massive source of income and prestige, which would eventually feed into the tensions that sparked the 100 Years' War. But more than that, the fall was symbolic. This fortress, built with cutting-edge design, funded by royal wealth and meant to defy the French king, was defeated not with might, but with strategy. Its collapse showed that no wall was too thick, no keep too tall to be outwitted. Even the greatest castles had cracks, not just in stone, but in leadership, politics, and human endurance. Let's hear from the people who witnessed these events or lived in their shadow. Roger of Wendover, chronicling the siege, noted the psychological warfare in play. The French, by shutting off all supplies, starved them into surrender. They died in droves, not by blade, but by famine. And in a letter from the French camp, a priest wrote, "We see their torches dim each night. We hear no songs from the hall, only silence and the creak of gates." Even the victors knew that the siege came at a moral cost. Hundreds died not in battle, but in the cold, trapped between hope and hunger. Today, Château Gaillard lies in ruins, moss-covered stone, hollow halls, broken towers. But even in ruin, it speaks volumes. It tells us that castles were not just tools of war, but of economic control, social hierarchy, and political ambition. That behind every drawbridge stood not just soldiers, but servants, cooks, and silent observers of history. It reminds us that even the strongest defenses can fall, not to brute force, but to clever minds, slow starvation, and moral choices no one should have to make. So we end with this reflection: were castles built to protect or to control? And if they were symbols of power, what does it mean when those symbols crumble? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more untold stories, forgotten truths, and hidden roots of the world we live in, subscribe and join us next time on The Forgotten Roots.